Hamas monitors Israel's prevention of displaced Gaza residents returning north. Israeli forces kill 15 Palestinians in the West Bank's Jenin. And 11 killed and 83 injured in Israeli attacks on southern Lebanon. It's 4 p.m. Cairo local time and you're now watching Qnews. We begin today's bulletin with the latest developments in Gaza. Hamas has announced that it is working with mediators to tackle the Israeli prevention of displaced individuals in southern Gaza to return to the north, which is a violation of the ceasefire agreement. Hamas criticized Israel for delaying under the pretext of the detainee. She is alive and guarantees for her release. Hamas held Israel responsible for the delays and affirmed its commitment through Bulletin. That came as thousands of displaced Palestinians have gathered waiting for the withdrawal of Israeli occupation forces to return to their homes in Gaza City and the northern Gaza Strip. Under the Israeli-Hamas ceasefire agreement, Israel was to begin allowing Palestinians to return to their homes in northern Gaza through a Netzarim Corridor. Israeli army spokesperson for Arab media, Avichai Adraye, has announced that the Netzarim route remains closed to displaced Palestinians returning from southern to northern Gaza. Adraye attributed the closure to Hamas's alleged violation of the ceasefire agreement. He emphasized that current restrictions, including the Netzarim closure, will remain in place until the release of Israeli civilian Arbel Yehud is finalized through mediation. He urged Palestinians to comply with safety directives and await further announcements regarding the route's reopening. The Palestinian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has urged the international community to provide urgent support for the Palestinian government's emergency relief and early recovery plan, which aims to facilitate the reconstruction of Gaza. The ministry emphasized the need for immediate solutions to the suffering of over 2 million Palestinians, especially those waiting to return to devastated northern Gaza. These efforts are crucial for Palestinians' resilience, unity and survival, aligning with international law and global peace efforts. Gaza's Field Hospitals Director, Dr. Marwan Al-Hamsa, has stated that 75% of medical facilities in Gaza have been destroyed and require rehabilitation. He added that 25,000 people require treatment that is unavailable locally. He stated that Gaza's infrastructure, healthcare system and medical equipment have been heavily damaged and urgent assistance is needed, including food, medical supplies and generators. Israeli occupation forces intensify their Iron Wall operation in Jenin while pursuing controversial annexation plans for the West Bank.
Israeli operation forces continue their Iron Wall operation in Jenin, launched on January 21st to target alleged militant infrastructure linked to the Jenin brigades. Offensive has involved ground troops and aerial strikes, resulting in widespread destruction and the displacement of over 2,000 families. At least 12 Palestinians, mostly civilians, have been killed since December. While Israel claims the operation is essential for security, the United Nations has called for restraint amid growing international concern. Meanwhile, Israeli officials have intensified calls to annex the West Bank. Israeli finance minister, who also oversees West Bank administration, has advocated for extending Israeli sovereignty over the occupied territories, aiming to block the establishment of a Palestinian state. Earlier in June 2024, he outlined plans for annexation through legislative initiatives and on-the-ground actions. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has also reaffirmed his commitment to applying Israeli sovereignty to all settlements, expressing optimism about potential U.S. support. These developments underscore a pivotal moment as military operations in Jenin converge. With political efforts to reshape the region's status. The international community continues to monitor the situation closely, concerned about its implications for stability and peace efforts.
Israeli occupation forces have continued their large-scale offensive on the city of Jenin for the 6th consecutive day. Since the assault began on Tuesday, 15 Palestinians have been killed, dozens have been injured or detained, and significant damage has been inflicted on civilian properties, public and private facilities, and critical infrastructure, including water and electricity networks. And for more analysis on the story, we now move to Selma in our newsroom. Selma.
Thank you, Hani. And for a further analysis on the current situation in Gaza, we're joined by Al Ahram Weekly Managing Editor, Khalid Dawood. Mr. Khalid, thank you so much for joining us on Qnews. And first off, how do you foresee the possibility of turning the current detainee exchange and ceasefire agreement in Gaza into a permanent cessation of hostilities?
Well, thanks, Salma, for having me. I mean, again, judging by the developments over the past 2 days and this sort of lull over the issue of reopening the Netzarim Corridor, which is basically an illegal blockade that the Israelis have established in the middle of Gaza due to Israeli complaint about the release of one of the female hostages and the debate over whether she's military or civilian. It's just an example of how many difficulties might come up as we proceed in the first temporary truce period of 42 days. Already 1 week have passed. But again, it's very obvious that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is looking for any excuse not to carry out this agreement and to resume the fighting in Gaza. I mean, if it's right now, the Palestinians, thousands of them have been stranded for almost 2 days, waiting for the opening of the route between southern Gaza and northern Gaza. And this entire part of agreement is being suspended because of attempts by Israel to put more pressure on the Palestinian side. So probably we might face several or many stumbling blocks on the way ahead, especially when we get closer to the beginning of the negotiations over the second stage, which is supposed to take us from the temporary truce to the permanent ceasefire that everybody is aspiring. So definitely the developments over the past 2 days since the handover of the second dispatch of hostages and the Israeli delay in reopening the route towards northern Gaza is a very kind of worrying sign of Israel's intention towards the implementation of this agreement and moving towards a permanent cessation.
Mr. Khalid, you've mentioned Erbil Yahoud, one sticking name that Hamas still holds as hostages, and Israel claims that it's a civilian. If you can expand more on why is Israel risking the entire agreement for her return in particular?
Well, I don't think that the Israelis are actually risking the entire agreement because it was no surprise for them. The Palestinian side, Hamas, they have delivered the names of the four hostages they plan to release on Saturday, a day before. And actually, even after the release of those four Israeli hostages, female soldiers, the Israelis went ahead and they also released 200 Palestinian prisoners. So I guess it's the common pressure tactic by Netanyahu and his attempt to get whatever more benefits he can get. Although the entire matter is rather non-significant, because even Hamas, the jihad group, they said that this woman, Mrs. Ehud, is going to be released next Saturday. And so it's not a real reason to lead or to push towards the collapse of the entire agreement. And I personally think that Mr. Netanyahu is under a lot of internal pressure from the families of the hostages, at least to finish the first part of the agreement and getting the highest number possible of Palestinian hostages who remain alive. Because, as you know, Salma, I mean, there are about 98 Israeli hostages believed to be in Gaza. Over 36 of those are believed to be dead. So again, the first dispatch is a very big, important dispatch that at least Netanyahu and his extremist ministers want to fix the families of hostages, although the families of the hostages have been demonstrating over the past few days, saying they do not only want the implementation of the first stage, but the second stage as well, because if the war breaks out again after the first 42 days, as Mr. Netanyahu has been implying, and as his finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, has been stating, this means that the remaining Israeli hostages who are alive in Gaza will have to wait for another long period of time before another truce agreement is being reached. So again, it's a matter of pressure tactics and more than being concerned over this particular Israeli hostage that's being debated, whether she's a civilian or whether she is a military person, as Hamas insists, because she is a researcher in a space Israeli program, part of the Israeli army. And as we know, in Israel in particular, the entire issue is very blurred, because all the Israelis serve in the army between the ages of 18 and 50. And that's why we saw the first stage, or the first dispatch of the hostages were released, mainly women who are not serving in the army, while the second group were four soldiers who are serving in the army. So again, it's pressure tactics. He wants to get something out of Hamas, out of jihad, one more outside of the schedule, so that he can claim that he has the upper hand, and he's the one who's placing his own conditions on the Palestinian side, and not vice versa. But again, my personal impression is that this problem will be solved. I mean, I hope very soon. There are already reports of the Egyptians, the Qataris, and the Americans being involved in order to solve this problem. And equally important, to be honest with you, Salma, to the release of this Israeli hostage is to allow the tens of thousands of Palestinians who have been camping in the street for 2 days, knowing that they are going back to ruins in northern Gaza, but nevertheless they still insist they want to go back to their homes, which I think is a very, very important sign. At the time, we've already heard those very controversial, very worrying statements from U.S. President Donald Trump, suggesting that Egypt and Jordan should take in Palestinian refugees until the Gaza Strip is being rebuilt. So probably maybe someone, Salma, should point out to Mr. Trump the images of those Palestinians who have been stranded
sorry
in the
for
streets.
cutting in, but I would like to ask you, speaking of the pressure that Netanyahu is prone to, can the pressure being exerted on Netanyahu by his far-right government, specifically Smotrich and Ben Gvir, lead him to backtrack on the ceasefire agreement in Gaza?
Well, Ben Gvir has already resigned from the government. He's been trying to pressure his equally extremist terrorist supporter of Zionism, Bezalel Smotrich, to take a similar step. Pardon me. So, I mean, again, it's very obvious that throughout the past 16 months of the war, that the Israeli Prime Minister gives priority to maintaining his right-wing coalition, his coalition through resuming the war and dragging on with this war rather than seeking a permanent peaceful solution, as nearly all world countries have been appealing to the Israeli government to do. But again, it's a very tricky situation. There are many factors at play. The Israeli internal politics are very complicated. The role of the pressure by the families of the hostages is equally important to the pressure that's being placed on Netanyahu by his extremist ministers, namely right now Bezalel Smotrich and a number of other Likud ministers who are no less hardline than Bezalel Smotrich and Ben Gvir. But again, I think that the near agreement within the Israeli government, at least so far, is that they want to finish the first phase of this agreement, and then it will become clear when we reach the 16th day of the agreement, which is not very far, when the negotiations over the second stage start, whether the Israeli side is serious about moving to the second stage, or they want to resume the war, as Bezalel Smotrich and Benjamin Netanyahu have indicated in recent statements.
Yes, speaking of this point specifically, could Israel's delay of the return of local residents to northern Gaza be detrimental to the ceasefire agreement?
It definitely would. It definitely would, because again, I mean, the Israelis have to be aware that yes, they're making a big fuss over this Miss Ehud, but at the same time, they were also expected for the first time that Hamas would hand them over a list that includes the number of remaining living hostages and the number of dead hostages. So, I mean, of course, the Hamas is not going to take the step of delivering that kind of list that Israel has been long demanding before the reopening of the Netzarim Corridor and allowing the Palestinians back to the north, to their homes, to their ruined homes, because again, it's a very important and strategic point, particularly at this time when we're hearing Trump suggesting moving the Palestinians to Jordan and to Egypt. So, I mean, again, the Gazans want to send a clear message to the outside world, to the US President Trump, to the Israelis, that even if their homes are ruins, even if they are totally destroyed, they would stay next to those homes because that's their land and they're not going to give it up under any conditions. And what we're hoping to hear from the US President, as a matter of fact, is pressure on the Israeli side just to finish this truce agreement or ceasefire agreement, but actually to proceed towards the final settlement and the two-state solution.
Sorry for interrupting you, sir, due to the shortage of time. That was Al Ahram Weekly Managing Editor, Khalid Dawood. Thank you so much for joining us here on Qnews and for all the information you provided us with. And now we're going to move back to Hani in the studio.
Thank you, Selma. Israeli occupation forces have significantly escalated their restrictions on movement around the city of Ramallah and the central occupied West Bank. Palestinian news agency reported that the Israeli forces closed key gates and intensified military checkpoints, further restricting movement. Additionally, Israeli occupation authorities issued demolition orders for 45 homes in the village of Al-Nu'man, located east of Bethlehem. The UNRWA director in the occupied West Bank has stated that the humanitarian security situation in the northern West Bank has worsened in recent weeks. The UNRWA director added that ongoing violence has forced many residents to flee Jenin camp. The military escalation and deteriorating security conditions have caused mass displacement, severely affecting daily life. As a result, UNRWA suspended educational activities and health services, urging the international community to intervene and protect civilians. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan has stressed on the importance of a ceasefire in Gaza and halting Israeli violations. This came during a press conference with the Iraqi counterpart Fuad Hussein. Fidan highlighted discussions on combating terrorist groups in Iraq, expanding cooperation by involving regional countries, and avoiding instability in Iraq despite regional disagreements. He emphasized Turkey's focus on close communication between Iraq and Syria's new administration and reaffirmed the importance of making the Gaza ceasefire permanent while continuing cooperation on shared concerns. And now we move on to the latest developments in Lebanon.
المستهدفين هن مدنيين.
الوضع شيء مرعب، شيء بخوف.
The Lebanese Ministry of Health has reported that Israeli attacks on southern towns have claimed 11 lives and the injury of 83 others. It added that 11 people were killed and 9 injured in Houla, with the wounded receiving treatment at the Tibnin Governmental Hospital. Additionally, the ministry confirmed in its statement that 8 people were injured in Kafrakilla and transported to Marajayun Governmental Hospital for medical care. Following a statement from the Lebanese Ministry of Health, the United Nations Special Coordinator for Lebanon, in a joint statement with the head of the UN's peacekeeping mission, has said that conditions are not yet in place for the safe return of citizens to their villages along the blue line and the deadline day for Israel's withdrawal under a ceasefire deal. Israel's military has not withdrawn its troops from southern Lebanon, even as many displaced people return to their southern towns. This occurred despite the expiration of the 60-day deadline for the Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire agreement, according to Israeli media. Following the agreement, which was mediated by the US and France, Israel has continued conducting ground maneuvers. The military issued warnings and set up barriers to prevent people from returning to their villages. The Lebanese army has announced that its units are assisting Lebanese citizens entering several border towns amid ongoing Israeli aggression. The army is ensuring safe entry into towns like Ait al-Shab, Bint Jbayl, Dir Sriyan, and others, as Israel continues to violate Lebanon's sovereignty. The statement condemned Israeli attacks that have resulted in casualties and criticized its refusal to honor the ceasefire agreement or withdraw from recently occupied Lebanese territories. Lebanese President Joseph Aoun has called on residents of southern villages to exercise restraint amid escalating events in the south. Aoun expressed solidarity with southern communities celebrating the triumph of justice and urged trust in the armed forces. He reaffirmed that Lebanon's sovereignty and territorial integrity are non-negotiable and emphasized his commitment to addressing the issue at the highest levels to safeguard their rights and dignity. Lebanese Prime Minister-designate Nawaf Salem has spoken with President Joseph Aoun to discuss the evolving situation in southern Lebanon. Salem expressed full confidence in the Lebanese armed forces, particularly the army, in safeguarding Lebanon's sovereignty and ensuring the safe return of southern residents to their villages. He reiterated his commitment to prioritizing the reconstruction of homes and villages in the south, Al-Biqa and Beirut, emphasizing that rebuilding is not just a promise, but a pledge. These are all the news we have for now, but here's a reminder of the stories we've been covering. Hamas monitors Israel's prevention of displaced Gaza residents returning north. Israeli forces kill 15 Palestinians in the West Bank's Jenin. And 11 were killed and 83 injured in Israeli attacks on southern Lebanon. This concludes our news bulletin for this hour, but please don't forget to follow Qnews on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram and TikTok at Qnews EGY to stay informed. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates here on Qnews.